Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Integrating Chemical Management with Chemical Approvals Workflow. I'm Ed Rakowski, Editor-in-Chief of The Synergist, a magazine of the American Industrial Hygiene Association. I'd like to thank all our listeners for attending today's event and especially ChemWatch for sponsoring this webinar. ChemWatch is an international company headquartered in Australia with offices throughout Europe, the U.S., and Asia Pacific. It has more than 20 years of service to the chemical safety community and thousands of clients globally, including hospitals, research institutes, and government departments. We have two presenters today. Jerome Marinkovich is Director of Product Research and Development at ChemWatch. He has more than 6 years' experience in the chemicals management marketplace. His professional experience in chemical risk assessment includes development and deployment of the ChemWatch Control Banding Risk Assessment and Approval System. Our second presenter is Claude Neri. Claude is the head of the Compliance and Research Department at ChemWatch. He has over 17 years' experience in the chemicals management marketplace. His professional experience as a chemical database project technical manager and chemical safety projects manager includes the successful management of a wide variety of projects such as chemical database web applications, molecular modeling, and QSAR techniques. Now I'll turn the presentation over to Jerome.
Thank you, Ed. Thanks, everyone, for joining today's webinar. After the last one, the risk assessment webinar we've done a couple of months ago, approvals is a natural progression because it also deals with placing the chemical in the workplace before it is allowed on site. So just a quick overview of what we feel the chemical approvals, why they're there, basically. To compete in a global marketplace and satisfy evolving demands of the customer and the market, organizations are introducing new products containing new substances on a regular basis. A multi-stage approval system can help organizations with streamlining the entire process to overcome both internal and external challenges of achieving the compliance and, of course, a safe workplace. Combining these external and internal requirements is challenging for any organization, not only in the chemicals management space, but also in organizing any part of the company. In this webinar, we will cover how software technology has evolved, especially in the last 5 to 10 years, to become a very suitable platform for hosting the chemical approvals governed by a workflow. So, if we just move on to the next slide, we'll cover how the chemical management cycle starts. So it usually starts with the evaluation of products or substances that will be used for a particular purpose. An effective approval system will provide an integrated approach to chemical approvals, bringing together several aspects of a review. These may include things like environmental review, health and safety review, which is generally done on a local level, regulatory, supply chain, and product management objectives, which are more strategic and can be on a global level. And obviously, that has to get integrated with the organizational structures, business processes, and procedures. In other words, these all of these components of an approval process are intertwined, and they stem over both internal requirements and external requirements. So in summary, we can say that approvals are driven by clear objectives and governed by regulations, policies, and procedures. So now I want to dive a little bit into the reasons why approvals are useful. And for that, we'll just ask Claude to run us through a couple of slides on regulation.
Thank you, Jerome. Regulations should and can be checked during several stages of an approval. A check against regulations concerning environmental release might show you that a substance is banned for use or may require special reporting under TRI, for example. In the health and safety stage, regulatory checks are very important. Company policies may prohibit the use of carcinogens, for example, or carcinogens might require an extra stage in the approval to ensure that the correct controls are in place at the point of use or exposure. So regulations don't always really paint a black and white picture. They may be used to decide the flow and approval rather than accept or deny it. A good example of how a regulatory reference could veto an approval simply on the basis of regulatory status. I've got a particular example here which also highlights the existence of a substance in a regulation that might not tell the full story. So the detail in the regulation can also be very important. Looking on the screen there, you see a few details about the end of life of a vehicle regulation that comes out of the EU. And that simply bans the use of lead, mercury, cadmium, or hexavalent chrome in articles for vehicles. The regulation, however, has got a lot of exemptions. So during a regulatory check, the approval stage would help ensure that the substance is to be used falls under one of those exemptions. Moving on, the hazard classification of a substance in itself is a great tool to use with approvals. The hazard analysis of a substance gives approvers a good grasp of the dangers faced by individuals, property, or the environment, should there be an incident with that chemical. Unfortunately, the classification of chemicals might be something you might describe as a bit of a dark art. We say this simply because of the lack of agreement when it comes to chemical classification between manufacturers. A fantastic example of this is the C&L initiative in Europe. Manufacturers and importers in the EU are required to submit classification to the C&L inventory. Currently on the C&L inventory, you find about 120,000 substances that have all been classified by various vendors. And this results from about 4 million notifications. So many of the common commodity and HPV chemicals can have hundreds and sometimes thousands of classifications, or notifications rather. Sometimes up to 30 differing classifications we've seen for a particular substance. So moving on from what I just explained, I've got some stats here that I've put together, which is just an analysis of classifications published by different vendors of fine chemicals. You can see that there's a great amount of disagreement, and the amount of agreement on the classification of any one substance between two companies rarely exceeds about 60%. So I think the main point to take out of this that even though the classification of a substance is a great tool in driving approvals, on its own it might give a misleading representation of the true hazards of the substance. Other checkpoints are required to ensure that you get an approval based on a variety of data from different sources, hopefully eliminating the variance you see in chemical classifications. So I'm going to pass you back to Jerome now.
Thank you, Claude. All right, so what Claude has summarized is a perfect example of how taking approvals into real-life scenarios can be quite a challenging thing, especially when you need to take into account information from various sources. So what I want to cover next is some of the chemical approval criteria that can be used during the approval process. For the purpose of the webinar, we just split these, and you'll have access to these slides and the recording so you can go over it in more detail. But essentially, we split it up into 5 different review types. So there's a regulatory, which is what pretty much Claude explained, workplace health and safety review, which is more of a local health and safety review, looking at the chemical or a product mixture in a workplace, in the context of the workplace. There's a global health and safety review, which will just go a little bit above the workplace and look at it more strategically, but still in the context of health and safety. There's the environmental review, and the reason why we separate that, because environmental is both internal and external, because it does draw a lot from regulations as well. And of course, business and operational. This review takes into account things like applying the chemical in a process, what is it used for, what's the product, distribution, financial aspects, and all of those. Now, we will look at all of these into a little bit more detail, but what I wanted to just say is that workplace health and safety review will assess potential impacts to the workers' health and safety. it will take into account following certain codes of practice or standards when it comes to storing the chemical, handling the chemical, and it's generally done by a local review. Okay, so if we can just move on to the next slide. Before I go into the building blocks of an approval system, so to speak, and we're talking about the building blocks here as a component, not about a particular software system, I wanted to just look at forms to start with. In my 6 years at ChemWatch, and even before that, I worked in a couple of corporate environments, and I'm no stranger to forms. I believe everyone attending tonight today had some exposure to forms to follow a particular process. So traditionally, forms are the central component of any information-driven system, and for an approval system, the same thing applies. So forms can funnel information from stakeholder to stakeholder, and that information is then captured as the basis of the approval. Why forms can't really solve everything is, well, they actually can solve everything, and they did used to solve everything. But today's tools, especially the evolution of software technologies, now allows a lot of automation. So a lot of these forms can be pre-populated automatically. Actually, you don't even have to look at it as a form. You can look at it as a system. So, yeah.
I might just mention that using a system to fill out forms based on rules or inherent properties of the chemical actually allows you to remove some of the subjectivity that occurs when different individuals might fill out forms. Yeah. Different people may have a different idea of how hazardous a substance is, or what should be ticked, you know, when looking at a low, medium, high box. But using software to pre-populate these generally will come with a set of rules, and therefore tend to make them more uniform.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Claude. All right, so if we move on to the next slide, this is where I actually go into the building blocks of a typical approval system. Again, this is not necessarily a software system. This can be all done using forms, even email. It doesn't really matter. But I just wanted to capture some tools and building blocks that would support a sophisticated approval system. So I already covered forms. Forms can be used to capture requests, comments, of course, checklists, any attachments that need to be, these are software forms, of course. Attachments would be physical documents. So from the initial request to the final approval, all the necessary information needs to be captured, and form is pretty much the best mechanism to do that. We'll dive into forms from a technical aspect a little bit later. Then there's a building block that basically the SDS itself and the data associated with the SDS. Now, that can be treated as a form as well, but the reason why we've separated it is because it is the integral part of the approval process. For a chemical, without obtaining the SDS and data from the SDS, you cannot make any meaningful decisions. Regulations is another building block, and here we will talk about the regulatory databases, or access to regulations that you can then query easily and make choices based on the query results. There are also red tags and red flags, the ability to actually use a particular query to a regulation to identify certain concerns that you may have. Next one is reports. Reports as a building block is generally some sort of a mechanism to build custom reports from the data captured during the approval process. So this can be a combination of data taken from the SDS, a combination of data that was inputted by different stakeholders in the approval process, and you can then generate documents such as, for example, safe use instructions, That may be a criteria in the automotive industry. Before the chemical can be allowed in production and workers are exposed to it, they demand to actually have an access to a safe use instruction. Safe use instruction is a combination of a chemical information, hazard assessment, risk assessment, and then safe use instructions. So several stakeholders have to build that document. So again, software tools can provide for that. Data can be captured, and then software can generate these reports automatically. They don't have to be manually built. Next building block of an approval system is the mechanism to run alerts. So this is where high impact information or critical information can be identified as more important than something else. Alerts, anyone using social media or anyone using the web these days will be no stranger to alerts. Every platform, Facebook, Twitter, wants to alert you to certain things that may be of special interest to you. This is no different to how an approval system should work. Workflows, another critical building block, is the brain of the operation. We'll go into more detail a little bit later. Escalation, again, an ability to escalate something due to time or due to a particular nature of a request. And finally, dashboard. Dashboard as a building block is more of an overview, a business intelligence tool, allow you to monitor and view your request and approval stages at all times. So these are the building blocks of an approval system. In our research that we've done, we've taken a lot of project management tools for software, for engineering, for manufacturing, all the information we received from the marketplace, from clients and non-clients, everything that we've evaluated, we've managed to sort of capture in these building blocks. Okay, so now I'll just go slightly into more detail on these. So forms. Software these days allows you to build forms. 10, 12, 13 years ago, you had to have a development expert to build a form for you. These days, most software tools allow you to build your own. So by combining things like text inputs, the number inputs, radio boxes, checkboxes, drop-down menus, checklists, you can pretty much streamline any set of information you wish to capture. Obviously, you can use data validation to support that, to make sure that something that's not valid cannot go through a form. Also, it's important to be able to build multiple forms, because someone as a supervisor in a production plant may want to fill in a different form to an environmental expert who's reviewing the chemical that may have a different set of fields they want to see and they want to fill in. So data captured using these forms can later be used by other building blocks of the approval process to generate reports, generate documents, even direct the workflow. One good example of that is that often production chemicals, especially in the aerospace industry and the automotive industry, sometimes there's a big difference between a product or a chemical that's going to be used to support the operation as opposed to be used in the final product, such as a car or an airplane. So when something is going to be used on an airplane, it requires special technical review or an extra regulatory review and things like that. So that simple checkbox stating that, yes, this will be used for that purpose can allow you then later to automate that, to include additional stakeholders to make sure that review gets done. Next building block that we mentioned is the SDS data and documents. So SDS holds all the information. Actually, I might pass this one on to Claude because he's the expert in the SDS part.
Thanks, Jerome.
Apologies, I got a bit
as Jerome was starting to mention, that the SDS does hold all the information fundamentals to any chemical approval process. There are many points of information that can be used to steer the approval workflow and ultimately approve or reject a chemical. Ingredient formulations found on the SDS will point you to the inherent hazards of the material based on cutoff values and resulting hazard classification. Ingredients also drive the regulatory check. Regulations are based on substances and very rarely on mixtures of any sort. Physical properties found in Section 9 also are important in determining if there are any special hazards or particular controls required for storage of the chemical. Transport information is also really useful, as well as giving you an indication to the level of hazard. It may also indicate the need for special controls, licensing, and reporting, and not to mention the extra requirements and costs for the transport and storage of these particular substances. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the classification of the substance itself is very important. And because of the large amount of information you find on any one SDS that's required to be analysed for the purpose of an approval, we feel that an automated system of approvals minimise the costs and potential areas associated with implementing a robust approval process. So earlier I spoke about regulatory checks also. We looked at an example using the ELV regulation in the EU. And regulatory checks can be used in a variety of ways. And they can be used to simply look for banned or restricted substances under a particular jurisdiction. In global businesses, a multi-tiered regulatory check might be implemented to approve use of a chemical in one jurisdiction but possibly not another. Internal policies might require the citation of a chemical, and a regulation is used as a trigger for approval or rejection of the chemical, or it might define the subsequent steps of that approval's workflow. Now, with regulations, the source of the regulations is important also. Official sources are always best to cite. However, they come in all sorts of formats. Most exist really as static documents that you can find on the web, and they can be a little bit difficult to search for the chemicals of interest. Moreover, this can be complicated with many chemicals citing chemical families or chemical groups. This makes the check much more difficult because it requires the person searching to have a fairly robust knowledge of chemical structures and the types of functional groups and how they behave and how they might impact the chemical.
Yeah, in other words, they will have to do research on every single substance every time.
Essentially, to work out what, it's very difficult to even know what chemical groups a regulation might refer to. If you take any one chemical, it might fall into 15 or 20 or 100 different chemical groups. To have to go and search for all of those as well you can imagine, can be quite time consuming. Some regulations that you find on the web have searchable engines, but they might not be updated with the regulation, we find quite a bit, or they may not have any notification of when things change. So for medium to large companies with many chemicals, or small enterprises which might not have the staff with the required skill set, these sorts of challenges can seem insurmountable without the use of a regulatory database. And I'll pass you back to Jerome.
Sure. Thank you, Claude. So another building block I wanted to cover is the reporting engine. So during the approval process, and there has to be multiple stakeholders, otherwise it's not an approval. So at least two. So in a more sophisticated approval process or a large organization, there may be 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 stages. I'm not entirely sure, but everyone is interested in a different aspect of review. So traditionally, everyone may have access to an SDS and some set of tools, and they have to read the SDS and read what the requestor has said, how they want to use it, where they want to use the chemical, and so on and so forth. Utilizing software tools, as I said before, data that's been captured from the SDS, from forms, from the regulatory checks, from any other sources that were done prior to generating these reports. Report can then generate environmental reports, standard operating procedures, personal protection, safe use instructions, toxicological reports, regulatory reports, anything that may be of interest to stakeholders. So that's why it's an important building block, because if you can, why not then give these people access to additional information to take into account? It all supports the due diligence. Next building block that I wanted to cover is the alert engine. So when you systemize any process, you have some sort of transitions between stakeholders, and these transitions can be governed with alerts. So if there's a delay in processing, if there's a significant regulatory concern, so there's a specific regulatory list that is triggered, or there are special internal health and safety concerns. For example, the chemical is a carcinogen, although that's usually covered with regulations as well. But some organizations basically say we don't use CMR products. So in other words, any criteria that's set either internally or externally can be the basis of alerts. So the reason why we've added this as an essential building block is our experience, essentially from the market. So today, there's a lot of email, there's a lot of social media, everyone is looking at screens a fair bit, and that very fact that you can take something out of the endless list of things that you need to see and read every day, and just to bring some special attention to something, we find that as quite a powerful tool. Yep, the next building block is the brain of the operation, the workflow. Workflow governs how the entire approval process connects. So essentially, all the components that we've covered so far, your forms, your documents, your regulations, your stakeholders, how the request is made, forms, everything is governed by a workflow. That means who will see what at what time and what can they do with it, what they have to do with it. Workflows can basically translate any process into a systemized stream of tasks, actions, and alerts. So I know this has little to do with the chemicals management, but the webinar is about applying approval system to chemicals management. So this is where the management comes into play. So I'm just going to repeat that the workflow can provide the tools and functionality to translate any process you wish to achieve into a systemized stream of tasks, actions, and alerts. That means you're bringing together the chemicals management and the organizational management. And the final building block is the dashboard. By dashboard, I don't mean a specific dashboard. I just mean an actual tool that allows you to quickly look at the entire approvals process, your requests, who has done what, who's doing what, are any approval requests getting stuck at a particular stage, and that allows an organization to then take a look from above, maybe make some choices about how the process is designed. So the late Peter Drucker, who's also known as the father of modern management, said that if it can be measured, it can be managed. So in any case, any software these days provides you some sort of insight, like one view into the metrics. So this is essentially why we've added it as an important part of the approval process. Okay, so we've covered some of the criteria, not in too much detail, but some of the criteria that can be used during the approval process, and then we broke it down, the approval system, into some building blocks. So now what I wanted to cover is a bit of technical stuff. So I hope not a lot of you will now switch off, because I'm trying to make this as user-friendly as possible. I just wanted to make sure that the concept of a workflow is easy to understand. So any workflow that supports any process can be summarized by utilizing three basic components. The major component of a workflow, of an approval workflow, is called a stage, and we've we've done our research on this, and generally any sort of a system that transitions from one stakeholder to another is using similar terminology. So stage will define like a major part of the approval workflow, and it's usually owned by one stakeholder or a group of stakeholders. It's going to make sense in the next slide. The next key component is an action. So an action is a particular task that someone has to do as a part of a stage to complete that stage. So there may be one action, there may be 10, but you cannot complete that stage and move along the workflow unless you completed all the actions. And then the third key component of a workflow is called a transition, which is essentially a component that governs how the request is communicated in the approval workflow. So whether it's approved and goes to the next stage, whether it's rejected and goes back to the requestor, whether it's returned to a previous stage for more information, or whether it's dynamic and it's based on some interesting regulatory criteria. So if we move on to the next slide, I've just applied this to a typical request and review. So imagine having a two-stage approval process, so a fairly small organization, and it only has people requesting the chemicals, and it has one set of stakeholders reviewing the chemicals. So there can only be a yes-no answer, or return back to the requester for more information. So typically in this stage, the owner of the request stage would be the end user, and that can be multiple people. Usually in software, they are defined by a login. So someone working as the end user has the ability to attach an SDS to a request, complete a form. So we go back to forms, and the organization chooses which information they want to capture, and then select locations, typically, because that's important for storage of chemicals and so on. So those would be a typical three things. And these are actions. So 3 actions: complete stage, submit. That then goes to the review stage, which is managed by the manager or the approver, where they have 3 different actions. They may need to review the SDS because the requester had to attach the SDS. The manager has to review it. They maybe need to complete a risk assessment, review some other document, and then make the choice whether to approve or reject. So in the following slides, we've actually prepared a fairly sort of what we feel could be a real-life scenario of a typical organization. So we have multiple stakeholders, and I'm just going to take a bit of time to sort of run you through what I'm going to show you. So for the purpose of the webinar, we've came up with 4 stages in the approval process. We have the request stage, obviously. That's where the chemical is requested. Local review is placing the chemical in the workplace, just looking at storage, looking at the risk assessment, how it's going to be used, and so on. Then we have a separate stakeholder handling the environmental aspects of the approval process. And finally, health and safety global review, so taking it from more of a strategic standpoint to more expert review. So we will go to the first part of, so we actually gave these people names, hoping that it might help with sort of reinforcing the message. So our requestor's name is Andrew, and he's requesting a particular chemical. And typically what he will do is a set of actions. So what we have here is just 3 typical actions that Andrew would have to complete to request a chemical. We can reference this back to the start of the presentation where we were talking about forms. We want to capture as much information about the chemical at the very start of the review. So Andrew has to fill out a form, and there's mandatory fields. They have to specify how they will use the chemical, what the method of application is, for example, a brush, roller, spray, other. They can have some questions like, do you have adequate spill management on-site disposal? Is it handled for the chemical? Or we can leave those questions for the manager. Second action that they would do is they need to select where the chemical will be stored, and that's important for the manager to make sure there's no incompatibilities later and so on. And finally, a task, a scenario. Our previous webinar in July was about risk assessment. So risk assessment is typically what places the chemical in the workplace from a task standpoint scenario. So they would have to specify either through a form or through another mechanism how they intend to use the chemical, how much, how often, what they will do with it, and that's all important for that review. So what would happen then is after they submit the request, so they completed all the actions. If you remember on slide before this, we talked about stage, action, transition. So the stage, Andrew's stage is completed because he has completed all the actions, and when he's clicked submit, then we have a transition, and the workflow governs the transition. So the request has transitioned to the next stage, which is the local review. And typically, then when we apply an alert, which can be SMS, email, alert is sent to Bruce, who's the guy you can see on screen, who's the local manager, and Claude will cover their review stage. Actually, no, I will cover this, sorry. Bruce. So Bruce receives an email, and the system sends Bruce an email. And Bruce will basically click on some sort of a link or log into their approval system, and they will see exactly what Andrew has requested. Now, Bruce now has a different set of actions to go through, obviously, because they're looking at it from a different aspect. They would typically review the form because that form captures the intention for the chemical. This is what the chemical will be used for, and this is how. So they need to review that to make sure they know. They will review the locations because now the local manager in the workplace may make a choice that I won't store it here, I might store it in a different place. Or you've requested it in a particular location, but I think we should allow it in the entire campus or entire building. So they can make these choices. Another action that Bruce might complete is review any storage requirements. So everything now is brought together because we've already taken the dangerous goods classes, UN number, we've taken all the hazard classification, everything from the SDS at the very start. That's what happens when the request is made. Obviously, the SDS is loaded and the data is extracted. Now Bruce has access to these pre-populated forms. So they don't have to read the SDS again. It's all done for them. So they will simply see that, okay, it's a dangerous goods 3, therefore, how much am I storing, if it's a flammable liquid, and so on and so forth. You can look at NFPA requirements. You can look at other requirements in other parts of the world. Another thing they may take into account is the storage incompatibility. Maybe Andrew has requested the chemical to be in a particular storage area where it may be incompatible. So there are guidelines in dangerous goods codes. There are guidelines of safe storage. It governs segregation, separation, and things like that, and software can definitely automate that. And finally, Bruce is a site health and safety manager. Therefore, they would make sure that the risk assessment is created based on Andrew's details. So Andrew has provided what's the intention, how the chemical will be used and where, and now Bruce can complete the risk assessment and make sure that the controls are in place, personal protection is available, and so on and so forth. So after Bruce completes all these steps, they complete a stage. So they've basically a sequence. They receive an alert, which is a building block. They complete all the actions that are required for that review stage, and they can then transition to the next stage, governed by the workflow. So I believe if we go into the next slide, we will meet our environmental officer, and her name is Cindy. Claude, if you want to take it away.
Sure, yep. So
typical environmental review will look at the potential risks and concerns related to the environment, the basis of which would be formed around the regulatory review. The regulatory review would possibly disclose environmental regulations that need to be complied with using the substance. Again, some examples, like I've mentioned before, chemicals that appear on the toxic release inventory, will require reporting. Chemicals that are PBTs may determine a push for the look for alternatives. The look for alternatives can be built into part of the approval process if chemicals appear on certain lists. So it can all be governed, the workflow can be governed by the regulations or other data coming from that chemical. So what was I going on to say? So it doesn't all come down to regulations, however. The power of the approval process can be augmented with the use of other data, as Jerome's mentioned previously, with SOPs and things like that. But with respect to environmental issues, the location at which the chemical is approved may be important. That area may not have the significant controls to mitigate release of that chemical. Environmental reports on fate, persistent and toxicity to aquatic and terrestrial animals and plants can greatly help the environmental officer making the right decision with respect to environmental issues. So the supporting data along that Jerome has mentioned several times can be quite more important at some stages than other.
Okay, so thanks, Claude. So for the purposes of the webinar, Cindy may have not approved this chemical, but we just decided that she did, just so we can complete the webinar. So now we've introduced the fourth stage, which is the health and safety review at the global level. So let's say this was requested for a site in, I don't know, Texas, but the company headquarters is in New York, for example. So this is where the company may have to make some strategic choices about the chemical because of the escalation, because of the nature of work that's done with the chemical. Maybe it ends up in a product on the market, so there's liability issues and things like that. So again, we just added some basic things that have to get looked at. So the health and safety team would look at the locations selected, but they would also make a choice whether they want to approve it globally. Often, this is actually an important point that I should make, that often it's actually global health and safety reviews have to make a choice whether they allow the chemical into the company from a strategic standpoint. Sometimes health and safety board review will make the choice to start with. So another thing they would actually have to look at is look at any regulatory concerns. We haven't gone into too much detail, but before Claude talked about regulatory databases and the importance of having that quick check. So let's assume you've got a product, it's a mixture. Data extraction will take all the ingredients out, so you have all the CAS numbers. At that point, you are able to check all the CAS numbers against particular regulatory lists using an automated system. So you could flag a particular chemical or a substance and look at it from a particular point of view. And finally, they could review risk assessment, but not from the workplace standpoint, but they can actually review the risk assessment to do a risk analysis. Okay, so that's a typical four-stage approval process. There's unlimited number of scenarios for an approvals workflow. I mean, every organization will have their own forms, but it's important that if it's systemized using the building blocks that we talked about, and I'm not sure, we may have missed some, but we've really done our research, so we're hoping we've covered at least most of it. Using those building blocks, one can simply create a workflow that will cover for most scenarios. So this slide is pretty much the last one, and I wanted to bring this into the discussion because these there are times when something is requested and it goes through a normal approval review, but there's something special about the chemical that simply cannot be reviewed and approved in the normal workflow. So what I'm showing you here on this slide is a high business risk review stage. And it will only be triggered if the chemical itself meets a certain criteria. So essentially, this is red flagging. Anyone who's using an email client like Outlook or Thunderbird or any of those has the ability to right-click on an email and flag it to make it a red flag item. This is a similar thing. So you can red flag a particular chemical, but the beauty of using software is that you can automatically flag it. So that regulatory check can be done automatically. And if your company has a particular interest in Prop 65 and you want to red flag every Prop 65 substance and product containing a Prop 65 substance, this can be automated through a software. It's not only for red flagging it, it can also govern the workflow automatically. So this stage high business risk review is only activated when the requested chemical meets the criteria of itself or one of its ingredients appears on a Prop 65 list. So I had probably simpler ways of explaining this in words, but you all have access to the slides, and you might be able to revisit it at a later date. And finally, last slide, we already covered dashboards, but business intelligence matters. Again, that's where we want to close. Where all of this is brought together is basically if you use a systemized approach to approvals and capture everything from a request to review to approval of a chemical, and you use forms and all the other building blocks that we've mentioned, then every single chemical is allowed on site using the same process, same review flow, and you have an audit trail of everything that ever happened. So if there's a chemical on site that's been approved and there's ever some incident or anything that happened, you can always go back and look at the basis that was the basis of the approval and the criteria used, revisit that, and essentially have a full insight in how the chemical was allowed on site, and maybe you can tweak the process to avoid the same thing in the future. So yeah, that pretty much concludes the webinar in terms of what we wanted to cover. We would like to thank you for your attention, and I think we can now pass it on to Ed. He's been moderating the webinar and the comments.
Thanks, Jerome. Thank you, Claude. Looks like we have about 10 minutes for questions. Just a reminder to our attendees, if you'd like to ask a question, please type it into the chat window on the right side of your screen and send to all panelists. The first one is this question from Robert, who asks, does the approver also manage chemical life cycle or only regulatory review?
Sorry, Ed, could you repeat that? Does the approval?
Sure. The question is, does the approver also manage chemical life cycle or only regulatory review?
Okay. This depends who the stakeholder is. There's not enough time to go into it in real detail, but chemicals management life cycle itself is your day-to-day chemicals management operations. So even though after you approve the chemical and it's allowed on site, that's when the chemicals management life cycle starts. That's when you have to keep the chemical up to date. You have to make sure that you're storing information about the volume. You have updated risk assessments. That may or may not be the same person. Typically, it's the local manager who would manage health and safety aspects of the chemicals. So the manifest, the inventory, risk assessments, data reports, and things like that. So all of these things can be handled by the same person, but they're not a part of the approvals workflow. What we showed you today is where each one of those stakeholders in the chemicals management life cycle has some tasks to approve the chemical. After they approve it, then another stream of work starts. So yeah, that's maybe a topic for a separate webinar. Actually, that's a good idea. Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I think yep. That's
okay.
all that I can.
We're ready for the next question. There's a question from Cheryl. She asks, how do you ensure that everyone does their part to not slow down the process?
Ah, beautiful question. Okay. Thank you very much for the question. I should have included this in one of the slides. The system ensures it. So if you use the building blocks, let me just go back to a particular slide. I'll see if I can find it. Here we go. All right. So how do you ensure? The stage has an owner. So if Bruce been notified about a review they have to do, then only Bruce can do the review, and they will be notified by email. If they don't do it within a set time frame, the system will alert them. They will escalate it. And obviously, the requestor will never get the chemical if Bruce or the reviewer doesn't complete their stage. So that's the beauty of systemizing it, basically. The systemizing of an approval process makes sure that every stakeholder does their bit. Otherwise, the chemical can never arrive on site. So yes, how do you ensure they don't slow down the process? Well, if you do have good visibility into approvals, and that's, I think, on the last slide, like a table of all approvals, the overall manager, who's in the end responsible for the whole thing, that it all works, they can actually see who is slowing things down. For example, someone may actually be really, really busy and have 6 or 7 requests waiting for them, and they can't do them the entire week. But what do? People need the chemicals. In that case, the manager who's managing the entire approval process can take a look at it and say, okay, well, we might actually reassign these requests to someone else to take a look at. And yeah, so again, that's the beauty of systemizing it. I hope that answers the question. Without a system, you can't manage people slowing it down, because you simply don't have a visibility that, you know, in 2015 we had 300 requests for new chemicals, and typically it always took Bruce the longest amount of time to review them. You cannot get to that conclusion quickly without having a software system. With a software system, you go in and you immediately see the metrics. Yeah. Okay.
There's a question from Sarah. Can you please discuss your scanning tool and real-time inventory management system?
Great. That's actually a topic for another webinar that we're going to run.
I believe it's the next one.
The next one, yeah. Applying scan-in, scan-out technology and asset management systems, barcoding onto the chemicals management as well. Chemical transfers, waste disposal, things like that. We're going to cover that in a separate webinar. I don't think they even, if we had another 15 minutes, I couldn't really give you the necessary detail yet. Yeah. So we're going to have to, we'll notify you of the webinar dates soon. So for the question, the interest though.
Okay. Here's a question from Aaron. Where does procurement and sourcing fit into the process?
Sure. So in the same model that we described, so utilizing entities, stage, actions, and transitions, there's, to a system, it is a machine after all. It doesn't matter if it's the financial approver looking at the cost, or it is an environmental expert looking at animal toxicity, or looking at aquatic, looking at an LD50 or some other value. So the system will govern the workflow. So if the requestor must specify in the form, so that form comes into play, price and who they're buying it from, that information can then be communicated to a financial approval stage. not only that, but any cloud-based software tools, and cloud-based is the way the world is going, will be able to integrate with procurement systems. Large organizations are definitely streamlining their purchasing. It's like their business eBay. They will actually decide at a corporate level, where do we buy things? They have negotiated catalogs, suppliers, things like that. So a chemical approval system can integrate with a purchasing approval system. So when someone requests a chemical, they also have to specify who they're buying it from and for how much. And that information can be, they can even use things like purchasing codes, project codes. So the financial approver can look at the accounts and make the choice whether to approve the purchase or not. Typically, what we would advise is do the financial approval first to establish that that purchase would, because it's a very simple, generally it's a very simple approval. It's a simple yes, no. So whether the budget's there, is it reasonable for the project, yes, no. After you get the financial approval, then you could actually do the chemical aspect, because the chemical review may be a lot more demanding for stakeholders and time-wise and otherwise, and they will spend all that time loading the SDS data, extracting, looking at reports, making reviews, and it comes to the financing department. They just say, no, we can't allow you because it costs, you know, $500 more than you've got in the budget. So we would, but in any case, by splitting it up into stages, actions, and transitions to a system, this can be applied to anything, not just chemical approvals. It can be applied to any approval system if you split it up like that, if you systemize it. At least we can't find a deficiency there. But if anyone's got any comments, or anyone would like to add more or make some comments about it, please do. Like, we would love to hear from you, because all of this knowledge was actually taken from our interaction with clients and obviously research on other systems that are quite established and sophisticated. Not chemical management systems, but project management system, approval management system, ERP systems, and so on.
Okay. There's another question from Madi. How is management of change handled after approval?
Okay, sure. I will just switch back to red flag one, and I think that slide would explain. So that's a great question. Obviously, stakeholders have made their choice on approving or not approving the chemical based on some information that was valid at that time. So I'm assuming what you're asking is that what happens 6 months later when a regulation changes, or when the vendor decides to publish a new SDS, or the company policy changes, so now we don't buy from this vendor. That essentially, we would suggest reapproval. So some sort of a rule-based mechanism that will, because in a system, you are talking about a live regulatory database. So you are updating your regulation in a database, and that database holds your chemicals, your inventory. So if the status of a particular chemical changes, software can very easily alert you or change the status of the chemical and send you an alert and say, this particular chemical requires re-review for the following reasons, and say it contains an ingredient that is now on Prop 65. This can be utilized using red tags, red flags, and so on. Obviously, another way of doing it is manually. So you actually go through a review, and you have a mandatory review, like before GHS, SDS had to be updated every 3 years, whether there's any changes or not. It was a perfectly valid in Canada every 5 years in the rest of the world. That was a perfectly, not perfectly good, but it was the law. So regardless if there's any changes. Now, it's another story that in 5 years, a lot of changes and new research is available. But you can apply the same mechanism. Luckily, software these days allow you to just say, okay, this particular chemical that was approved last year, if anything changes in terms of classification, regulation, on any other
steps in the process.
Any steps in the process, request re-review and place the chemical into some sort of quarantine until it's re-reviewed. So again, there's the beauty of systemizing things, and I really love systemizing things, and I really love the fact that software these days allows us to integrate things really nicely. But yes, great question, and we would suggest do a re-review of the chemical, if anything changes.
Okay, thanks, Jerome. I see that we're at the top of the hour, so unfortunately we're out of time for additional questions. Jerome and Claude have included their contact information in the chat window, so if you didn't get a chance to ask a question or submit a comment, please do so to them. I'm sure they'd love to hear from all of our participants. Thank you, Jerome and Claude, for your presentation, and thanks to ChemWatch for sponsoring today's webinar, and to all of our listeners today. Please be on the lookout for notices about upcoming Synergist webinars, and have a good day.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Much appreciated.